thank you so much for joining us today to talk about this.
Well, thank you.
I just want to start by saying it's rare to put out a request to two high-ranking senators from opposing parties to do a joint interview and then have them just immediately say yes.
We actually are really good friends.
Don't tell
anybody.
So why do you guys think you agreed to do this interview?
Well, this is an issue that's touched both of our lives, and I know it's touched your life as well. When I came to the Senate, now 14 years ago, Susan was already a leader on the issue of Alzheimer's. Together, we put together legislation to say, let's put a national plan in place. We can talk about Alzheimer's in terms of its costs, about $320 billion in cost a year now. That's going to go up to $1 trillion. And we've got to find a way to both treat and, God willing, find a cure. And Susan really has carried a lot of the burden on this, but you might want to talk about what you did even last year in terms of the funding levels.
Well, first, let me say that Alzheimer's doesn't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican or a socialist or an independent or have no political party. It does not discriminate. And American families across this country have struggled with this disease. When I first came to the Senate, there was very little discussion of Alzheimer's. It was considered not an illness, but an inevitable part of growing old. Then we learned that it is an illness. And Mark has been a tremendous leader in working to get funding from the NIH so that we can do the research to find a means of prevention. Our lifestyle factors involved. Is there a way to more effectively treat Alzheimer's? Can we delay the onset? And ultimately, can we find a cure? And that's why we've worked together as the leaders of the Alzheimer's task force in the Senate.
But I think it's also, this is an illness that has touched both our families. Let me tell you, this is my mom. She had Alzheimer's for 11 years, 9 years of which she didn't speak. My dad and sister took care of her full time. She was up in Connecticut. And I know what an enormous burden it was on them. And one of the things we're working on as well is, can we get at least a small tax credit for families so we can give a break to these caregivers? I mean, the fact that this is a disease that you've got to be with your loved one 24/7, and we need to give some relief. And I know, Susan, you've got a similar story as well.
I do. I lost my father, my grandfather, and 2 uncles to this devastating disease. This is a picture of my father, Don Collins. He was a World War II veteran, fought in the Battle of the Bulge, wounded twice, 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star, ran our family business, was a state senator, always very involved in the community. And to see this awful disease rob him of his mind was really horrible. And it was so difficult for my mother, who, like Mark's father, took care of a spouse for so many years. And it takes a real toll on the caregiver, who is often the older spouse. And I miss him every day. He died in 2018 after many, many years. But he was at home for probably 8 years before going into the veterans home in our hometown of Caribou.
You know, and we think about the fact that sometimes these jobs as senators, you know, you got to do a lot of things that are a little tough. I think we both say what your mom went through and what my dad went through is much tougher than anything we go through in our day-to-day lives. And if we can prevent that from some future family having to go through that challenge, then we'll have done great work. And again, Susan was able to get almost $4 billion. We worked together in the last appropriations bill to do more research, and we're starting to see the FDA start to approve some drugs. But when we think about the toll, the current cost of $320 billion a year going to $1 trillion, and that doesn't even measure the human costs that so many families suffer with.
Just listening to you guys talk about this, I could tell that this is a different type of issue than the typical policy that you guys fight for. Would you say that's true? Is the emotional connection, is it different?
It is. It's both personal and policy. Alzheimer's is our country's most costly disease. And as Mark said, the trajectory is frightening, not only in terms of the projection that it would affect double the number of Americans that are affected today. It will reach, it's expected to reach more than 12 million Americans and rob them of their minds and personalities, but also $1 trillion by the year 2050. So that's the policy side, but virtually all of us have experienced family members with this devastating disease. And that does give us an added urgency to being constructive, getting the research done, and see what we can do.
I don't think you can find an American anywhere, and I know this affected you as well, that doesn't have a story of a parent, an aunt, an uncle, and one of the most horrific things is that we've seen increasing numbers of middle-aged individuals called early onset Alzheimer's. And that's even more devastating. My mom, she was in her late 70s, and she lived another 11 years, but my goodness, I've had families come in where a spouse has been in their 40s, and they have the onset of this horrible disease. And the awful thing is, once you get it, with the current state of therapy, you can maybe slow the progress, but there's no getting better.
It never ends well.
It never ends well.
So let's talk about the proposed bill. In 2011, you first authorized the National Alzheimer's Project. What were the goals back then? And then all these years later, do you think it has achieved those goals? And then now you're asking to reauthorize it. So what are your future goals with this project?
Well, the goals back in 2011 were to create an expert task force that would focus on this disease, educate people about it, and help come up with avenues of research and a budget. There's a related bill that requires the submission of what's called a bypass budget. In other words, rather than going through OMB, it comes directly to Congress so that we know how much money the experts think we should be spending on this research in order to make a difference. So we accomplished those goals. We had an overly ambitious goal for having an effective means of treatment or prevention or even a cure by 2025. Obviously, we're not going to be able to reach that. But had we not set that kind of ambitious goal, I don't think we would have been able to sustain the momentum that has been behind research that has given us tantalizing clues and FDA's approval of 2 drugs under the emergency use authorization that are controversial but do hold some promise.
And do you believe the project led to those proposals, those
Absolutely.
possible treatments?
It's led to those treatments, and what I get excited about are the number of additional drugs that are in the pipeline that I think will even have better results. And I also think, as Susan mentioned, this is also about educating fellow members of Congress, but for that matter, the country. I think the country is educated now. I think it's one of the reasons why as well we worked in the last couple of years on providing at least a small tax credit for those families who are affected, so that caregiver can get a few hours off a week to give them a little bit of relief. So we're at this. We're going to stay at it until we get to that point where there is both an ability to slow the degeneration of this disease, God willing, to find a cure, but also to make sure that those caregivers get the support they need.
Let me just add a point on that. Having respite care for the caregivers is so important because this is 24/7. And many people who are afflicted with this disease wander at night, for example. So this is really devastating, and respite care is important. The other point I wanted to make is on the research. Originally, all the research was focused on amyloid plaque in the brain. Now, we're not sure whether amyloid plaque is the cause or the consequence. And we're looking at the tau neuron. We're looking at the role of inflammation in the brain. We're looking at lifestyle factors. All of that came about as a result of our bill and the letter that Mark and I lead every year asking for funding.
I want to talk about the second bill, which is where the NIH director comes with a budget directly to Congress. How much money are we talking about for this type of research? And then obviously there's always a concern about spending. So why is that spending worth it?
Well, Susan is now the vice chairman of the Appropriations Committee, so we're going to uniquely, she and I are going to write a letter, and one of the recipients is going to be to Susan. And this idea of making sure that the money, that Congress has direct oversight. Too many times we fund a program and along the way, one agency takes out some money for overhead, then somebody else takes out some money for distribution. We want to make sure this money gets to the source. But you want to speak further to that?
So Mark is exactly right. The reason the bypass budget is so important is then we don't get a filtered estimate of how much is needed. We get what the experts say is needed. I remember,
conversation, who are these experts? Like who's on this
it
project?
is a panel of scientists and also family members, but mainly scientists who come up, who are experts in the field, and they come up with the budget and present it directly to us. So that means that the Office of Management and Budget can't say, no, you can only ask for X. It goes directly to us. And that's unusual. We have that with cancer, and I think with AIDS, with HIV/AIDS funding, but generally that's not the case. Generally the budgets all go through OMB, and you don't know what the real need is. So that's why the bypass budget is named as it is, and that's why it is so important.
And we still obviously make the ultimate decision. So we've still got that piece of oversight. They need to come back and keep us informed. But as you've seen, we have 2 drugs that have gone through the FDA process. The more recent one seems to have even a slightly higher efficacy. I'm hoping for much more to come. But this has been it's been a long haul. And as Susan indicated, 10, 11, 12 years ago, this was not even recognized fully as a disease. It was almost just expected part of growing old, called dementia. We now have got the level of research that really has opened up the possibility of a variety of causation factors. And we're going to keep following the science to get this disease to a point that hopefully, God willing, cured, but at least slowed in the interim.
There really is no investment that pays better dividends to the American people than our funding of biomedical research, and particularly in this area where we're dealing with the nation's most costly disease. And that's something that I think we need to remember as we talk about the amount of money that we're putting into it. It is dwarfed over time by the cost of treating and caring for people.
So do you guys think that your colleagues will agree? We've got a Republican and a Democrat here. Do you think that this is going to be bipartisan?
We've had a pretty good record. I mean, as Susan said at the outset, this disease doesn't discriminate based upon your political party, your race, where you live in this country, and the exponential rise, both in terms of lives in danger and cost. It would be completely fiscally irresponsible if we don't get this done.
I think I saw on Congress.gov that it passed unanimously in 2011. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes.
So do you anticipate the same thing happening this time?
I certainly
I
hope so. I'm on the Senate committee that will take up the bills, so I hope that we can get it through. And with Mark's strong support, I'm sure we'll get it through.
You know, the end goal is obviously to find a cure or at least a treatment for this. When you guys speak with these experts on this project, are they optimistic? I'm asking for a lot of families out there that are dealing with this. Do they think that we're close?
I think they've gotten more optimistic. Susan indicated that the notion that it was caused by some of these constraints in your blood vessels in your brain, that may be an outcome, not a causation. The fact that we've got a broader array of potential causation methodology, that means science has broadened. And I think as we've seen in other disease states, oftentimes the initial premise doesn't end up being the case. I've got a daughter who's a type 1 diabetic, and I remember when she first got diabetes, and they said we're 5 years away from a cure. She's 20 years on as a diabetic, but we have made remarkable progress, and some of the curative ideas of 20 years ago are completely different today. I'm hoping and praying for the same with Alzheimer's.
I've talked to researchers all over the country. I've visited the Mayo Clinic, which has tons of expertise with Alzheimer's and related dementia. I've gone to the University of Pennsylvania. I've talked to people at Harvard. I've talked to researchers in my own state of Maine. And they are optimistic, but what they need is a guarantee that their funding is going to continue from year to year. Because if they enroll people in clinical trials, they don't want all of a sudden the money to disappear or be cut severely. So that's why having this trajectory of funding for this research is absolutely vital to getting to the point of prevention, better treatments, or a cure.
My last question on this subject I want to ask is just, we said before it doesn't get better once somebody's diagnosed with this. And the disease can seem relentless and sort of unstoppable, and so people can lose hope once their loved one has this. And maybe they don't want to get their hopes up. Do you think people should have hope that we could find a cure and a treatment in our lifetime?
I think you've got to have that hope, because otherwise the challenges are so debilitating. And again, as we think about particularly younger people starting to get this disease midlife. So you got to be hopeful. It's been a longer haul. Even the drugs that are on the market right now are only incremental. So we've got a ways to go, but we wouldn't be still doing this if we didn't have hope. And listen, we're in a business that if you don't have hope, it's a pretty crummy business. So on this one, we got hope.
I agree.
Great. Well, that's all I had to ask about these bills, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.